There are a total of 25 remembrances, 10 being in the DLC and 15 being in the base game, and we are going to rank every single one of them based on importance of duplication. And I also am going to tell you which option is the best one as well, because yes, every single remembrance does have multiple options to pick, and you can only pick one option, but there actually is a way to duplicate the remembrance to have you pick the other option. And you can do this by the walking mausoleums in the base game or the coffins in the DLC. Now, unfortunately, there are only 7 mausoleums and 3 coffins, so you can only duplicate 10 of the 25 remembrances. So picking which ones to duplicate can be a very important choice. And that's what I'm going to be doing for you guys today. I am mainly going to be speaking from a PvE perspective, so definitely keep that in mind. But I might end up talking about some of the weapons and how well they perform in PvP too. Now, before we do get started, I want to touch on the Heart of BAYLE, because BAYLE does not drop a remembrance, it just drops a dragon heart, but it still kind of works the exact same way in that you can pick one of 2 options, but unfortunately, being that it's not a remembrance, you cannot duplicate it, so therefore it's not going to actually be on the ranking list, but I can still tell you guys which one I do prefer in either the BAYLE's Flame Lightning or BAYLE's Tyranny. Now, BAYLE's Flame Lightning is going to be like a single target type of dragon spell that kind of works somewhat similar to Dragon Maw. It does do more damage than Dragon Maw and does go a bit further, but it is a lot slower, consumes more FP, and for some reason it actually does do less stance damage as well. Dragon Maw does like 15 more stance damage, and this spell is like one of the best in the entire game. So there's not many circumstances that I'd actually rather have BAYLE's Flame Lightning, but it does have a couple of things going for it. One, you can spam it over and over again, so with consecutive inputs, it might end up performing a bit better, but that's only if you have really long openings, and also it is just a pure arcane scaling, whereas Dragon Maw does require a handful of faith, which I always end up recommending going into a bit of faith if you were going to go into an arcane build, just to utilize a lot of the really good dragon spells. And this is also true for BAYLE's Tyranny, which there actually is no spell that works like BAYLE's Tyranny in this like short range, high damaging AoE attack that actually gets an arcane requirement too. So you might think that it ends up being a bit more useful because BAYLE's Flame Lightning has another spell that kind of directly outclasses it, but the thing is BAYLE's Tyranny is just not good. The AoE itself does not go that far. It's very inconsistent, especially when you're like on higher levels of terrain. The damage of the explosion just does not register sometimes. It consumes a lot of FP. It has a really long animation, and the damage is still not even that good compared to some other types of AoEs in the game. Now, to start off with, to what I consider the least useful remembrance to actually duplicate, it would be the remembrance of the Lord of Frenzied Flame of MIDRA, as the options for this remembrance are the Great Sword of Damnation and MIDRA's Flame of Frenzy. And the Great Sword of Damnation is the obvious pick in this instance because MIDRA's Flame of Frenzy incantation is just god tier awful. It is just a complete waste of FP as it does terrible damage, long animation, no hype armor, doesn't really go that far as an AoE either. And worst of all yet, it does a whole bunch of madness build up to you. And you can probably proc madness on yourself faster than you actually could on an enemy, which madness can only be procced against NPCs or in PvP anyway. And if you actually like to have a madness type of AoE aesthetic, things like Unendurable Frenzy or the Flame of Frenzy are much better spells. And as for the Great Sword of Damnation, this one is definitely meant to be for PvP because its weapon skill does classify as a grab attack, so against NPCs or other players, the skill can definitely put in a lot of work there. But unfortunately, outside of that, as a strength faith option that does a bit of holy damage, there are going to be some other options out there that I'm probably going to like more. Things like the Ordovis's Greatsword, which is another greatsword with very similar scalings, I'm just going to value more because it can do more damage, and its skill, which is also a close range AoE, just performs a lot better. Number 24, the Remembrance of the Omen King of Morgott. This one is another obvious option because out of both Morgott's Curse Sword and the Regan Omen ban, the Morgott's Curse Sword is the obvious option because this is actually a really solid weapon, and the Regal Omen ban is a complete useless tool in this game. It's a skill that scales off intelligence and faith, and even at max level, it is practically useless because for its long animation and its 50 FP cost, there is no instance to where I would like to use it unless you want to lead off a boss fight with it because it actually does do 30 stance damage at a further distance, which is okay, but yeah, it's definitely not worth duplicating for, and it's definitely not worth getting over the Morgott's Curse Sword because that weapon is one of the best curved greatswords in the game. It actually has the longest range while also weighing the least. It gets a pretty decent dexterity and arcane scaling. It gets passive bleed buildup, and obviously with an arcane scaling, there actually is a way to improve it, which is really nice. And its weapon skill can be really good. It lunges in far, it can stun lock very nicely, it's extremely easy to use, you get some hyper armor. Like the only downside of the skill is probably going to be its FP cost, because the entire combo can consume 40 FP, but it's definitely a premium weapon. At number 23, the Remembrance of the Lich Dragon, which has FORTISSAX's Lightning Spear and Death Lightning as its 2 options. Now, when you do have a Remembrance that has both options kind of work with the exact same build, it inherently just makes it a bit more useful when it does come to duplicating the Remembrance, but in this instance, I would still not even bother, even though they're both incantations, because one, they're both somewhat close-range AoE spells, and FORTISSAX's Lightning Spear is just the obvious pick here because Death Lightning is one of the worst incantations in the game. It can do an okay amount of damage, but the range is not there. The actual lightning strikes go in complete random directions, and the hit detection can just be complete god tier awful. It takes up 2 slots. It has a 47 faith requirement, and by the time that you actually meet the requirements, you're more likely than not to actually have access to Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike. And that spell kind of works very similar, but just way better, because the lightning strikes go out a lot further. They actually travel in the exact same direction every single time, and it's not going to be as RNG heavy. And also, it's just going to do way more damage, because every single lightning strike actually has its own hitbox. Whereas for Death Lightning, even if you hit with every single lightning strike, it's only going to do the damage of 1. Which I don't really know why they made it work like that. It does also have this little bit of a Death Blight buildup, but Death Blight basically does nothing in PvE, and in PvP it's pretty useless too. So yeah, FORTISSAX's Lightning Spear is the one that I would go for, because this is actually a very decent close-range AoE spell. I like to use this type of spell when I am fighting enemies like Knights or Omens, because it can send them flying to the ground, it can stunlock them, and just do amazing damage. The only downside might just be its longer animation. At 22, the Remembrance of the Fire Giant, which has both the Giant's Red Braid and the Burn O' Flame incantation. And this is another Remembrance that I would not bother duplicating because Burn O' Flame is the obvious option, and Giant's Red Braid I just do not like at all. It is like one of the worst weapons in the game in my opinion, because to start off with, it's a whip, which this is probably the worst class in the game, due to them having like straight sword types of damage but being slower than things like a Great Spear, and somehow doing less stance damage than a dagger for some reason. But for the Giant's Red Braid in particular, when it does come to its unique skill in Flame Dance, it is pretty decent at stun locking. It can go very far, it goes through walls, but the damage is just horrendous, and you get stuck in a very long animation. You can cancel the animation, but only like at the beginning and the end part of it. The entire middle part, you can get staggered out of it very easily, as you just don't get any hyper armor, and you're just never going to win that trade because the damage is just not that good. And when it comes to the Burn O' Flame incantation, this is one of the best fire spells to use, as it is an extremely high damaging AoE. It might not outperform things like Ancient Dragon's Lightning Strike, but it can be more consistent against smaller types of enemies because the flame pillars spawn closer towards the player, and it actually can send these smaller enemies flying up into the air. It is a bit more RNG heavy, and it does involve you having to finish the animation to benefit of every single flame pillar, because if you do get staggered out of it, you lose out on a lot of damage. But I still think it's an S tier spell. 21, the Remembrance of the Bloodlord, which is off MOHG. Now this Remembrance has the Mulgwyn Sacred Spear and the Blood Boon incantation. And this one is another obvious pick. Mulgwyn Sacred Spear is like one of the best weapons in the game, whereas Blood Boon is a very below average type of spell. And this is another Remembrance that I wouldn't really care to duplicate either, because Blood Boon does not do good damage at all, but it can do some okay amounts of bleed buildup. But the thing is, there is another spell in Swarm of Flies that also does pretty bad damage, but that one just has better tracking and just does way more bleed buildup. Now, Swarm of Flies is actually a bit bugged to the point where I still wouldn't really care to use it, but even then, Blood Boon is still not even that good, because the only way that I'd really care to use it is if I throw it at the ground in front of my feet and have enemies walk in towards it, which at that point, if you're going to be at closer range and wanting to proc bleed, you might as well just use a bleed-based weapon, and if you don't have access to a bleed-based weapon, then I'd rather use things like Blood Flame Talons or Furious Blade of Arnspark, because those ones can actually do more bleed and actually just do a lot more damage. But yeah, Mulgwyn Sacred Spear is easily a top 5 weapon in this game. It has the longest reach out of all the Great Spears, it gets amazing damage with a Strength Arcane build, and its weapon skill can stun lock enemies, proc bleed really quickly, just do amazing damage. Like, yeah, it's kind of broken. At 20, Remembrance of the Blasphemous, which does have the Blasphemous Blade go up against the RYKARD's Rancor, and this one is still a very big discrepancy. You have the best weapon in the entire game in the Blasphemous Blade, going up against a very subpar spell in RYKARD's Rancor, which this spell is actually a fire damaging sorcery, which can be pretty unique, which means you can gain access to fire damage with an intelligence-based build. But the thing is, compared to all the other magma sorceries, this one actually does have the highest faith requirement. And compared to the other magma sorceries, it might just be the worst one too, because this actually does shoot out an AoE fire projectile that has a very delayed explosion effect, and the AoE just goes in like complete random locations, so against smaller types of enemies, there's a very good chance that it misses, especially when you do take into account that really slow delay, and it's only really when you fight larger enemies that don't really move much, that are also weaker to fire damage to where it's actually going to be useful, and even then, I don't really care to use it. Because yeah, the only thing that actually fits under that description is an Erdtree avatar, and there are lots of other spells in the game, even the magic-based ones, that could actually just outperform RYKARD's Rancor. And the fact that you do have to spec into a lot of faith, and that it takes up 2 whole slots, makes me just not really care for it at all. So yeah, I would never really duplicate it. And when it does come to picking between this or the Blasphemous Blade, obviously the Blasphemous Blade is like the best weapon in the game due to it being a great sword with really good damage. And it has a skill that is just broken. It goes really far, can hit multiple enemies, do amazing damage, and it gives you health regen on every single hit. And it's like a decent chunk of health regen too. Like the thing is just silly. Number 19, the RENNALA Remembrance, which has both Rennala's Full Moon and the Carrion Regal Scepter. Now, the Carrion Regal Scepter is the obvious option here, in my opinion, as once you do get to higher levels, it is going to be the highest damaging staff if you don't include the loose stat staff. And even then, I might still prefer the Carrion Regal Scepter because the loose stat staff does make your spells cost 50% more FP, but only really do like 10% more damage. So once you are at these higher levels, the Carrion Regal Scepter is literally just the best option. It does have a 60 intelligence requirement, which is kind of annoying. Like a lot of the staves in this game have like really high intelligence requirements, even though you can get them really early in the game, just like this one. The staff also does actually have the passive effect of boosting moon sorceries, which the other option in the Remembrance is going to be a moon sorcery in Rennala's Full Moon, which is a slow moving projectile attack that does consume a lot of FP, take up multiple slots, have high intelligence requirements, and probably not really do that good at damage. But the thing is, it does debuff enemies to make them take roughly 20% more magic damage, and it does like suck in some spells as well. So if you are going to be rocking like an intelligence-based build, this is pretty much a must-have. If it wasn't for Rani's Dark Moon existing, which pretty much does the exact same thing, but it just adds frost buildup on top of it. It does cost like 10 more FP, but you're only going to be using this spell like once anyway at the beginning of the boss fight, so that 10 extra FP is not that big of a deal. Now you can actually get Rennala's Full Moon a lot earlier in the game, but the thing is, it has a 70 intelligence requirement. And by the time that you actually get to 70 intelligence, more likely than not, you're going to have access to Rani's Dark Moon. So despite it being a really good spell, it's obviously not going to be as important as the Carrion Regal Scepter, and if it was to come to duplicating a Remembrance, there's not really much purpose in it, being that there's another spell that does the exact same thing, but just better. At 18, we have the Remembrance of the Grafted, which we get off GODRICK. Now, inherently, this one being like the first Remembrance that you can get in the game, it automatically just makes the importance of duplication not be that high, because you can just go straight into New Game Plus and just get the other option practically straight away. But both options are actually somewhat decent. I definitely think the Grafted Dragon is going to be the better option, because it is a fist-based weapon, therefore the stance damage is going to be really good, the movesets are pretty fast, and the weapon skill can actually output a high amount of damage. It is a close-range fire-based attack, but the animation is relatively quick. The recovery frames are basically instant, like you can roll out of it straight away as soon as you use the skill. And it does make you lower to the ground, so some attacks can go over your head. The only downside is that you cannot two-hand it, but having the one-handed fist moveset is not too bad, because the charged heavy attacks are really fast and can do 30 stance damage. But for a one-handed fist charged heavy attack build, the Parter and Kata can end up doing it better. And even then, those things are pretty just outclassed by the Star Fist anyway. And when it does come to the axe of GODRICK, it is a decent damaging quality-based great axe. And the fact that it is an early game Somber weapon automatically makes it a bit useful, but compared to another early game quality weapon that requires Somber Stone in the Bloodhound's Fang, doesn't really mean that much. But in terms of its skill, I command thee kneel. It is a decent close range AoE attack, can stun lock some smaller enemies. I kind of wish the AoE was like a lot larger, and also wish the damage was a bit better, especially for like the first two initial slamming attacks. But it's overall not a bad weapon. At 17, we have the Remembrance of the Natural Born of ASTEL, which does house both the Waves of Darkness Ash of War and the Bastard Stars weapon. Now, I do think the Waves of Darkness Ash of War here is really good, and definitely the better option of the two, as it actually is a pretty big magic AoE attack that you can equip onto larger types of weapons, and it does result in a nice follow-up swing as well that can output some nice damage and some nice stance damage. But probably the coolest thing about the Ash of War is that when you do pair it alongside a Cold Infusion, every single one of those magic AoEs can actually proc Frost too, which is really cool. Now when it does come to the Bastard Stars, it definitely is one of the better flails, which is not really saying much, but it does get an A scaling in intelligence, and its weapon skill and Nebula can honestly be kind of broken. It lunges in really far, does amazing damage, good stance damage, great stun lock potential, as it does have like these delayed explosion magic attacks. Now, unfortunately for the Bastard Stars, is that one, it's a flail, which is one of the worst weapon types in the game because it pretty much takes a hammer and just makes it worse. And when it comes to the Bastard Stars in particular and its skill in Nebula, it's just going to be a worse version of the Wing of ASTEL, because the Wing of ASTEL version of Nebula literally comes out faster, can do more damage, can be spammed more, does more stance damage, and it consumes less FP. Like the only thing the Bastard Stars has going for it over the Wing of ASTEL is that it can lunge in further. So it's not going to be like completely outclassed, but I myself would never really go for it, especially when it does come to having to duplicate the Remembrance, because there's no point of me actually using one of my limited duplications that pretty much works like something else, especially when it's just not as good. Number 16, the Remembrance of the Regal Ancestor, which you get off the Regal Ancestor Spirits, does house both the Winged Great Horn and the Ancestral Spirit Horn Talisman. Now, the Winged Great Horn is going to be the better option here, in my opinion. And that's not because of the weapon itself, because the weapon actually does kind of suck. It's a quality-based great axe that just does not really get good damage. Like, if you wanted to use a great axe, there's a lot of the other infusible ones just are going to perform a lot better. But its skill in Soul Stifler is actually very useful because it basically is the best debuff in the game when it comes to how good the debuff is and how easy it is to use, and for how little FP it costs as well. Like, only 12 FP to summon an AoE to an enemy stand inside of it, they can just take 30% more damage for the next minute. Like, this is genuinely amazing. Now, unfortunately, it is going to require at least 20 strength and dexterity just to be able to use it, because the way that I would use it is if I did actually have the requirements for this weapon, I would just switch to it, use the skill, debuff an enemy, and then switch back to my main weapons, which, yes, can be kind of inconvenient. And also, the debuff effect is just bugged. Basically, every single debuff in the game is bugged to where it's only getting PvP types of values, and this is literally half as effective. It's only getting 15% of a debuff, which is still pretty decent, but obviously it's a big far cry from the 30% debuff it used to be doing, and this has been bugged for the longest time, and they just haven't fixed it. But even with its bug, I'm still going to value it more than the Ancestral Spirit Horn, because this talisman only gives you 3 FP for every single kill. Which, if I use like one carry and slicer, that consumes like 10 FP. So that's not really doing much for me. And if you actually wanted to save on FP, you're better off going with actual damaging based talismans, because actually having better damage means you're inherently saving on FP. Or you could just go ahead and spec into a couple of FP flasks. And if the entire thing is just saving on more flasks, you can go ahead and use things like the Crimson Sea Talisman, which is going to save you on a lot of healing flasks, and you can afford to use more FP flasks. And even if you wanted to have an FP regen type of talisman, things like the Assassin's Cerulean Dagger, and eventually when you get to the DLC, the Blessed Blue Dew Talisman, even though I think that one's overrated too, they're just going to end up outclassing it. At 15, the Remembrance of Hoarah, which we get off Godfrey or Hoarah himself, does give you the option of either Axe of Godfrey or the Hoarah's Earthshaker Ash of War. Now, for our picking between the two, I am going to go with Hoarah's Earthshaker, because the Axe of Godfrey is just not that good. This thing should be like one of the best, if not the best, strength weapon in the entire game. Should be the poster boy of strength, and it's just not, because it only gets a C scaling in strength, and because it's the Axe version of the Colossal weapons, it also gets some of the worst stance damage too. Like, even great hammers can get more stance damage than this thing. Now, typically, if you do liking things like stance damage or an average moveset, or even just raw damage by itself, the weapon skill can always make up for it. But yeah, unfortunately, the Axe of Godfrey skill is not that good either. Regal Roar for 25 FP does do this AoE slamming attack, which is actually somewhat similar to the Hoarah's Earthshaker skill, but the Hoarah's Earthshaker Ash War is just going to be better because it actually does more damage, more stance damage, and you get a follow-up input to do even more damage and more stance damage. Like, it genuinely is really good. And you can put this Ash War in basically any weapon in the entire game. The only downside of the weapon skill is that it is a close range long animation, so against some like really quick bosses, specifically in the DLC, might not perform the best. But for other slower types of bosses, and definitely for crowd control, I think this is a very high A tier Ash of War. But back to the Axe of Godfrey, after using the weapon skill, it actually does change up your heavy attack slightly and give you a bit more damage. And you can get more damage out of the heavy attack, especially if you use things like the Raw Medallion. But the animation is so incredibly long that the DPS is just going to be less. And the funny thing is, it does just as much stance damage too. I don't know why this big like stomping, swiping attack doesn't do like amazing stance damage. Because yeah, the entire combo does roughly 36 stance damage, which is less than a regular hammer. Like, if you do a charged heavy attack with a club, that will do more stance damage than the entire charged heavy attack of the Axe of Godfrey. Like, this thing should have had an S scaling in strength, and that heavy attack should have been way better. At 14, we have RELLANA's Remembrance, which does house both her Twin Blades and the Twin Moons sorcery. Now, I do think the Twin Blades here is the better option. It's inherently just very useful because it's one of only 2 Intelligence Faith weapons in the game, the other one being the Sword of Night and Flame. Now, I do think the Sword of Night and Flame is just better due to its better scalings, and that the skill just hits like an absolute truck. And for the RELLANA's Twin Blades, both versions of the skill, the Magic and Fire one, just don't really perform as well as a Sword of Night and Flame version in terms of its damage, but I still like it very much because both skills complement each other a lot better than the Sword of Night and Flame skills do, because the magic version is a quick projectile attack that you have the option to fire it for a long time or a really short time, and the fire-based version is a short-range AoE that can actually output some nice damage, some decent stun lock potential. And since the RELLANA's cameo buff, it is an extremely powerful option. I don't really care much for the Power Stance Light Greatsword moveset, but it still is perfectly serviceable. I think my major gripe with the weapon, outside of the fact that it might just be a bit outclassed, is the fact that it scales better off strength and dexterity than it does faith and intelligence, which is super annoying, because you want to go all into faith and intelligence just the benefit of using the skill. But I still like it's more than the Twin Moon Sorcery, which the sorcery actually is not too bad. It is an AoE spell that actually gets somewhat decent range, gets really good damage, has nice stun lock potential. The entire combo can hit very hard, send enemies flying up into the air, and actually now does get a bit of hyper armor. But the thing is, for 2 whole spell slots, a 72 intelligence requirement, and 47 FP cost, it's just not worth it. A spell like this should be having like twice as much range. And also there are lots of really good magic AoE options in the game. Gravitational Missile, Zamor Ice Storm, Fleeting Microcosm. All those spells I'm going to value more because they're not going to be as risky to use, and they're going to offer you a very similar benefit. Number 13, the Remembrance of Putrescence, which you get off the Putrescence Knight that does have both the Putrescence Cleaver and a Vortex of Putrescence Sorcery. Now, I think the Sorcery is definitely going to be the best option here. It is a very quick range-based AoE projectile attack that does do magic damage and do a decent amount of frost buildup as well. Sometimes the spell can actually hit twice and just end up doing twice as much damage and twice as much frost buildup if you just hit at a certain distance. But I think the best part about the skill is just going to be its ease of use. It just covers such a nice wide radius. It's a really quick cast. It's basically guaranteed to hit the enemies every single time. And it's not only good for damage, but it's also good for crowd control. The problems with the spell being is that it does take up 2 slots. It's not going to be the cheapest at 29 FP, and it does have a faith requirement as well, so it's really only going to be meant for those faith and intelligence builds. But if you are rocking a faith int build, this might be a genuinely good option. Now, as for the Putrescence Cleaver weapon, it is not too bad. It's decent stun lock potential. It's an okay strength arcane weapon. Not really too sure why it does get an arcane scaling, because there's nothing really that it actually helps benefit off that arcane scaling, being that it actually does get some frost buildup, which frost is nice to have, but it only gets 55 frost buildup, which is not really that good, especially because if you do go with a cold infusion, for the most part, you're easily getting over 100 frost buildup. Like, there are some things to like about it. It is a great axe that does get some slashing damage. You do have a skill that has multiple different options, whether you just want really big damage in one hit or good stun lock potential. It's not going to be that expensive either, but I think the major problem with the weapon is that it just tends to be outclassed by the Wild Strike skill, and you could just go with a cold infused great axe with Wild Strikes and probably just end up getting a better weapon. Number 12, Remembrance of the Dragon Lord. Now, this one in the base game, I would have put it a lot higher on the list, but since the DLC releasing, they nerfed the Dragon King's Cragblade to be in a very terrible state. Because even though it is a heavy thrusting sword, which is a very solid weapon type with a really good moveset, it is actually going to get the lowest amount of damage compared to all the other ones due to its split damage and only getting scalings in strength and dexterity. But it also has a skill that doesn't really serve much of a purpose as it once did, because the skill does have you turn into a cloud and come crashing down towards the enemy, and when you are in this cloud animation, you do get infinite hyper armor, and it could potentially stun lock some smaller enemies. And when you do have it fully charged, it can slightly improve the damage and just make it go a lot further. Now, the thing is, the damage is not really that good even when fully charged, because it doesn't work with things like the multi-hit talismans nor Godfrey's icon for some reason. The tracking can also be super weird because it just end up overshooting a smaller target and you just end up missing. And the only purpose that it actually did have was its stance damage. Because even though it didn't have as much damage and was a bit inconsistent to use, it could stance break really quickly. But they nerfed the stance damage really hard, and I just don't really find much value in it now. Now, the other option of the Remembrance is the PLACIDUSAX's Ruin, which this is another very mediocre option in my opinion, but it might end up being the one that I end up gravitating towards anyway, because it can be a very high damaging spell, especially if you actually do aim the laser breath attack correctly, because the entire combo can just shred every single boss. Now, the obvious downside is that it's going to be a really long animation. It does take up 3 slots, consumes over 60 FP, and you're not going to get any hyper armor too. As soon as you're airborne, you get hit once and just clap straight to the ground. So the only time that I really ever would use this is if I'm fighting bosses with really long openings, or if I have like a spirit summon, or if I'm in co-op where your summons can actually take the aggro for you, and you could just use this to clean out a whole room of enemies, or just potentially melt the boss. At number 11, we have the Remembrance of the Shadow Sunflower, which you get of the SCADUTREE avatar. And both options in the Shadow Sunflower Blossom and the Land of Shadow spell, they can be somewhat decent, and inherently if you are a DLC Remembrance that has somewhat decent options, the importance of duplication is going to be valued a bit more. But with that being said, about this Remembrance itself, I honestly don't even know which one I would really go for because I don't value either of them. The Shadow Sunflower Blossom is actually a really good weapon, but the thing is, it is just completely outclassed by the Blood Fiend's Arm, because the Blood Fiend's Arm gets the exact same moveset, but with a Faith build, it just gets more damage because the Blood Fiend's Arm has just been bugged forever, to where with a Faith type of build, you just get ridiculous amounts of AR. And the best thing about the Shadow Sunflower Blossom is that really quick downward slam heavy attack, Because yeah, unfortunately, its weapon skill kind of performs somewhat similar, but it's just going to be a worse version. It might be a slight bit better at stun locking enemies, but their heavy attack can literally output more damage and just do a lot more stance damage while not having to consume any FP. So there's very few circumstances where I would use a skill over the heavy attack. And if you were going to go with a charged heavy attack build, then the Blood Fiend's arm just does that better because it has the exact same animation, but it does get an additional AoE effect that just makes it do more damage and more stance damage. And combined with the fact that it gets higher AR with a Faith build, and that you can go back and forth between fire and holy damage, and actually infuse it with a more useful skill like Royal Knight Resolve, it's just going to be completely overshadowed. Which, speaking of which, the Land of Shadow incantation is kind of like the equivalent of Golden Land, but just as a spell. But the thing is, it just doesn't really go as far, the projectiles travel slower, and it consumes 40 FP, which is just way too much for how much damage it does do. You can get an okay amount of damage if you use it at closer range because it does get an AoE explosion as well, but there's not really much point of having an AoE explosion and a projectile attack in one if it's only really going to be good at closer range. Like at that point, you're better off using a lot of other AoE incantations in the game. And if you wanted a ranged-based holy projectile, things like Discus of Light, Multi-Layered Ring of Lights, they're just going to be way better. Number 10, we have Malenia's Remembrance, which does have the Hand of Malenia and the Scarlet Aeonia spell. Now, before the DLC, I had this Remembrance be a lot higher because I do consider both options to be very good. The Hand of Malenia does get the second most range out of all the katanas and does get the highest amount of damage on a dexterity build if you don't include weapon buffs. The skill can be extremely high damaging for how little FP that it does cost. It can stun lock really well. I kind of wish the skill didn't really consume as much stamina, and I wish there was like a way to actually delay the follow-up attacks. Also, the bleed build-up with the skill is just not really that good either, and it would have been cool if there was like some health regen mechanic in there too. But overall, it still is a very solid weapon, and the Scarlet Aeonia spell, I honestly value more, because Scarlet Rot is one of the best status effects, and specifically the spell-based versions of Scarlet Rot, for some reason just do twice as much damage, because the weapon Scarlet Rot does like roughly 15% damage over 90 seconds, whereas the spell-based versions do over 30% damage. You can just like instantly proc it on a boss because it does get a decent amount of Scarlet Rot build-up, and you're just guaranteed to do a third of the boss's health bar just like that. Now the thing is, I'm probably going to lean more towards the Hand of Malenia in this instance, unless you obviously do have a faith-based build and you don't really plan to go to dexterity. And the main reason being is because the Romina Remembrance does have Rotten Butterflies, and Rotten Butterflies I think is just the direct upgrade in my opinion, because it also does get that 30% rot damage, but it only takes up 1 spell slot compared to Scarlet Aeonia taking up 3. And Rotten Butterflies literally does more rot buildup, like a lot more rot buildup. Like against larger types of bosses where you typically want to be able to proc Scarlet Rot, Scarlet Aeonia does like roughly 500 to 600 rot buildup, whereas Rotten Butterflies could easily do well over 1,000, even 2,000 rot buildup. It is just ridiculous. If all those butterflies connect, you're doing more damage and more rot buildup. They might be slightly a bit more inconsistent against smaller types of enemies, but the fact that it still only takes up 1 slot, I'm just going to value it more. Now, the fact that you do get it towards the end of the DLC means that actually still is somewhat of an importance to duplication when it comes to the Malenia Remembrance, but probably not as much. The Remembrance of a God and Lord, which we get off RADAHN, Consort of Miquella. Now, this is the only Remembrance in the entire game that has 3 options for some stupid reason. They decided to have 2 separate Greatsword of Radahns in a Lord and Light version, but also have these weapons practically get the exact same scalings, movesets, weight, range, and the only difference is going to be its skill, which could have easily just been a stance-based skill and then just combine these weapons into one. So inherently, just by having more options, it might be a bit more important to duplicate, especially because you're the final boss in the DLC. So I pretty much just would duplicate it by default anyway. But the third option that we have is a Light of Miquella incantation, which I consider to just be the best one of the bunch, as it is a very high damaging AoE holy projectile attack, and the projectile can go really far. Like the best use of this spell, in my opinion, would to be like if you're gonna fight enemies weak to holy damage at a further distance, you can like lead off the engagement with something like this. Now the thing is, for a 72 faith requirement, 2 whole slots used, and a 48 FP cost, it's just not worth it. I don't know what it is when it comes to like these really expensive spells that have these really long animations and having them just be completely mediocre. Don't know what the thought process was there. Like this spell should be easily doing like twice as much damage, but it honestly still would be the option that I do go with, because the other Greatsword of Radahn weapons, both of them are pretty much identical to the STARSCOURGE Greatsword when it comes to like the weapon design and moveset and stuff, but the STARSCOURGE Greatsword can literally get more damage with the exact same build and just have a better skill. And between both the Lord and the Light version, I do like the Lord version a bit better, because it does have a skill that can just completely replace the light attack combos. Because the skill gets nice hyper armor, it lunges really far. When you go spec into a decent amount of faith, those holy pillars can actually do some decent damage. And the light version honestly isn't that bad. especially since they actually changed it to where like the holy pillar attacks now scale of AR. So like funnily enough, these holy projectiles for the lights version are actually mainly doing physical damage now. And it pretty much is just a pure quality based weapon. Like honestly, both weapons are not that bad. But it just annoys me because like this is the final DLC boss and these weapons could have been so much cooler. And you literally designed 2 separate skills and you could have easily just put them in a stance. And if you had them in a stance, you could use RELLANA's cameo and be getting 45% more damage out of both of these skills. Like this thing should have had scalings in every single stat and be like one of the hardest hitting weapons in the entire game, especially at higher levels. Could have had a unique moveset, could have had a blood flaming attack. Like I don't really know why they had to do it like this. And as number 8, we have the ROMINA Remembrance. Now, as I just talked about with Malenia's Remembrance, I do value Rotten Butterflies a whole bunch, and this is definitely the better option here. Because as I said, the Scarlet Rot of this spell does over 30% damage to a boss's health bar in 90 seconds, which is just insane. And it can proc Rot on basically any boss that's not immune in just one attack, doesn't matter how high the resistances are. And the reason why I'm still going to have this at number 9 in terms of how important it is to duplicate is because the weapon in the Pole Blade of the Bud is honestly not that bad. It's a halberd that gets slashing damage and the Guardian Sword Spear moveset while actually getting more range than the Guardian Sword Spear, gets that really good arcane scaling, gets passive rot buildup, gets a skill that can actually proc rot pretty quickly too. So like on paper, it sounds really good, but the thing is, Scarlet Rot doesn't scale off Arcane, so the fact that it does have an Arcane scaling doesn't really mean much. Like if Scarlet Rot did scale off Arcane, it'd instantly be a lot more valuable, but I think the most disappointing thing about the weapon is going to be its skill in Romina's Purification. It does have you like fly around a whole bunch, and like leave behind these like Scarlet Rot clouds that can do a bit more rot buildup. Now the thing is, it doesn't really proc rots that much faster than actually just using the light attacks themselves, and the damage and stance damage just suck. So it's to the point that the skill doesn't really serve much of a purpose, outside of like maybe making yourself a harder target to hit and like dodging in and out of cover. But it would have been a lot cooler if this was just like a really high damaging skill. Like there was no reason for this to just not be really good damage. Number 7, the Remembrance of the Dancing Lion, which does get both the In-Range Divine Beast Talisman and the Divine Beast Frost Stomp. I think both options here are very solid. I probably am going to lean more towards the In-Range Divine Beast Talisman because that one is just going to be more useful, as this talisman does actually boost the damage of all storm-based attacks by 10%, and these can be some of the most broken attacks in the entire game. Things like Stormblade, Zamor Ice Storm, Stormcaller, Divine Beast Tornado spell is okay as well. But the reason that I actually would duplicate this Remembrance is because Divine Beast Frost Stomp is also very solid. It is just like a better version of Hoar Frost Stomp, as it can just do more damage in very similar speeds and actually do some stance damage, unlike Hoar Frost Stomp that literally gets 0 stance damage. But the best part about it is that you can fully charge it to make it do even more damage. And with things like Godfrey's Icon and the stomping based buffs from the DLC, this can be an extremely powerful skill, because it's easy to use, it does it in an AoE, so it's good at crowd control, it's good at damage, and it's going to be able to proc frost, so you can debuff enemies pretty quickly too. And the thing is, with cold-based skills in this game, they're not just going to be for intelligence-based builds, but they're also for dexterity builds, because all these cold Ashes Wars scale off both. Number 6, the Remembrance of the Mother of Fingers, which we get off METYR, does house both the Staff of the Greats Beyond and the Gazing Finger. Now, for me personally, I think the Gazing Finger here is the better option, but the Staff of the Greats Beyond might be more useful to you, especially when you do get a bit later into the game, because in most cases, you're going to be running like a Faith and Intelligence build if you are at higher levels. And the Staff of the Greats Beyond can literally cast both incantations and sorceries while actually getting respectable damage. Now, the thing is, it's not going to really be the most damage. The Golden Order Seal and the Print of the Death Staff are just going to outclass it. So if you actually want to go through the effort of just clicking a button to switch back and forth, it's just going to end up being optimal. But when it does come to convenience and not having to switch back and forth, the Staff of the Great Beyond is going to be perfectly fine. And in fact, when it does come to casting sorceries, it actually can outdamage all the other intelligence faith-based saves at these medium levels. So it still is really solid, but honestly, the Gazing Finger is kind of a cracked option, because this is a colossal weapon that has only gotten better over time with the increased speed of its light attack combos, and especially those rolling attacks, they're really fast now. But the best part about the weapon is its skill in Katawa's Resentment. When you have this bad boy fully charged, it does this massive holy-based AoE attack, kind of similar to like the Wave of Gold skill from the Sacred Relic Sword. But it actually can do more damage, and it can send enemies flying up into the air for actually less FP. Now, no, it's not going to end up going as far or as wide as a Sacred Relic Sword, and it's not going to really do it in as quick as an animation, but this thing can be extremely powerful. It can go through walls, it can repeatedly stunlock enemies. This thing is probably the best thing to actually kill NPCs as well. Like every single one of them can just be cheesed extremely quickly. And it's so close to being like a high S tier and like a top 10 weapon in this game. The only things that's stopping it is that for some stupid reason, it doesn't work with either the Godfrey's icon nor the Shard of Alexander. And I don't know why. Like this AoE holy attack doesn't get boosted by those things. And another unfortunate thing is the scalings of the weapon. The skill itself does scale a bit off intelligence and faith, but it actually scales better off faith. And unfortunately, it gets an E scaling in Faith, which is just annoying. So if you actually want to go into the skill damage, you have to spec into a stat that's not going to really end up boosting the damage of your weapon by much. So I wish this thing actually had a really good intelligence phase scaling and actually worked with the Shard of Alexander and Godfrey's icon, because it would easily be a top 10 weapon. But yeah, unfortunately, it's not. Number 5, we have the Remembrance of the Impaler, which does get both the Spear of the Impaler and Messmer's Orb Incantation. Now, I think both of these options tend to be very similar in terms of performance. They're probably both around that lower A tier mark, but I might end up preferring the Spear of the Impaler a bit more. But if you do already have like a set weapon in mind and you have your Faith build, just go with Messmer's Orb, or better yet, just duplicate the thing. The Spear of the Impaler does get some very decent damage with a Dexterity Faith build. It is a great spear, so the stance damage and the range can be very nice. Its weapon skill and Messmer's Assault is actually really good. The total damage that it can output is just ridiculous. It can stun lock enemies. The first part of the skill actually goes deceptively far. It pretty much is a projectile attack with how far that it goes. And if you have an opening long enough, it can just destroy everything. Now, unfortunately, there are a lot of bosses in this game that don't give you an opening long enough, and this thing doesn't really get the hype armor to trade out either. But it's fine, you have a great spear. If you don't have an opening long enough, you can just go use your charged heavy attacks. Oh wait, the charged heavy attack sucks because it's a projectile attack, and therefore because it's a projectile attack, it has to consume a lot of stamina, do dog shit damage, basically do non-existent stance damage. Like, it's just a joke. I don't know why they feel the need to do this. Like, if it had a regular heavy attack or the Mesmer Soldier Spear heavy attack, it would easily be an S tier weapon. But even then, with its shitty ass heavy attack, I do think it's the better option. Despite how much I do like Mesmer's Orb, which I think is the most fun spell in the entire game, it's really not that good, mainly because it doesn't get any hype armor, takes up 2 slots, does have a 31 FP cost, which can be worth it, especially if you do have it fully charged. But yeah, the thing is incredibly fun. It can like lunge in towards the enemy really quickly, explode in their face, send enemies flying, do some decent stance damage. But I'm only going to really like it when you do have it fully charged, which it is going to be a longer animation that you can get staggered out of incredibly easily. So if this thing just had some hype armor, it would be a lot better. Number 4, Remembrance of the STARSCOURGE of STARSCOURGE. RADAHN does get both the STARSCOURGE Greatsword and the Lion Greatsbow as an option. Now, I do think the STARSCOURGE Greatsword is the better of the two, but if you did already have a weapon in mind, I would honestly go with a Lion Greatsbow, because a Lion Greatsbow can be a great complement to strength-based builds, because typically if you have a strength-based build, you don't really have much of a way to kill these larger bosses consistently, unless you end up going with like a Claw Mark Seal with Pest Threads, but the Lion Greatsbow could probably do it better, because the skill in Radahn's Reign can just fire off a whole bunch of these arrows that can just do ridiculous amounts of damage, and yeah, against these larger bosses, it can just destroy them. Even against smaller ones, it can actually stun lock pretty nicely too. And it also is a great bow, which is fantastic for like sniping enemies. If you're going through like legacy dungeons and you want to pick up enemies at a distance or one at a time, it can be really good at doing that. But yeah, the STARSCOURGE Greatsword weapon is honestly amazing. It is a paired Colossal Sword, therefore if you two-hand it, you do gain the Power Stancing combo, which is great because you only have to level up one weapon, and you're only going to bear the weight of one weapon too, which tends to be one of the biggest downsides to Power Stancing larger weapons. Now, for some stupid reason, the stance damage for the paired combo is just terrible. Like, it does less stance damage than if you were to use a light attacks one-handed, and I don't really know why. Now, thankfully, the damage is actually still really good, and the skill is amazing in Starcrawler Cry, which does have this big AoE attack that sucks in enemies towards you, and a big AoE follow-up explosion that can just destroy basically everything. You get a good hype armor. It's not going to be that long of an animation either. Does some decent stance damage. I think my only gripe is that the initial roaring attack doesn't do much damage and it consumes 20 FP. I kind of wish that was only like 5 or 10 FP. Would have been a lot cooler, but it doesn't really change the fact that it's still going to be one of the better base game weapons that you actually can get pretty early on. Number 3, the Remembrance of the Black Blade from Malekith, which does house both the Malekith's Black Blade and the Black Blade Incantation. Now, inherently, the fact that it is later in the game and the fact that both of these weapons kind of require the exact same build makes it very important when it does come to duplicating it. And thankfully, both options are actually really good too. Malekith's Black Blade can be one of the better strength faith-based weapons, as it is a Colossal Sword that gets some really high damage, and its skill can just melt so many enemies in the game in Destined Death, as it is like somewhat of a close range AoE attack. Now, due to its really long animation, it might not be the best thing, especially in the DLC with enemies that are just going to melt you out of it. And unfortunately, specifically for the DLC section, the destined death damage of a time effect actually got nerfed just for specifically the DLC area to be like half as effective. And for some bosses like BAYLE, it's a third as effective. So it's kind of unfortunate that it's not going to really be that good of a weapon. But honestly, better yet, I would go with Black Blade Incantation if you did want to get a very similar effect, because the spell can actually do just as much damage, if not more damage, especially against larger bosses, because it can hit multiple times. And it's going to be a spell. Therefore, you can actually free up your weapon slot to actually end up being something different that's going to be good in both the base game and the DLC. Number 2, the GIAUS Remembrance, which all DLC and endgame based remembrances are going to be very important to duplicates because you don't have to go through the entire game again just to be able to get the item. And I think the GIAUS Remembrance is the most important one in the entire DLC, purely because both options are genuinely amazing. Now, they are going to require different builds for the most part. The Sword Lance is going to end up being for your strength builds, and then obviously Blades of Stone is a sorcery. It's going to be for your intelligence builds. And I do think the Sword Lance one here is the obvious option. It is easily one of the best weapons in the entire game. Definitely a top 3 strength-based weapon. It's a heavy thrusting sword that can get more damage than great axes for some stupid reason. And it does get the heavy attack of a great spear, which I don't typically like as much when it does come to like the running heavy attack. But when it does come to the regular heavy attack and the guard counters, the great spears are literally going to be better. So the sword lance can be one of the best options when it comes to the straight up light attack spamming, guard counters, certain types of skills as well. Like this is like the best L2 stick in the game. If you wanted to use things like impaling thrust or piercing fang, blood tax, repeating thrust, this one might just be the best option, especially if you were going to go the blade based build, because for some reason the sword lance gets colossal sword types of bleed buildup. So that one is an obvious must pick. But Blades of Stone is honestly one of the best sorceries in the game too, which is already useful because a lot of sorceries in this game tend to just be magic damage, and Blades of Stone might just be the best range-based AoE attack, because when you have it uncharged or fully charged, it can do amazing damage. Fully charged, it can stun lock enemies, do really good stance damage, it goes really far, and it only consumes 18 FP. Like, this thing is just amazing. The only downsides is that if you are trying to fight an enemy in the air, it's obviously going to miss, and if they are very fast, some of the AoEs aren't going to really keep up to the enemy. But I genuinely think this is an S tier spell. And that's number 1, the Elden Beast Remembrance. Somehow, some way they made it to where the final boss weapons are actually some of the best weapons in the game, in both the Sacred Relic Sword and the Maracas Hammer, and both are going to be with a faith-based build. And the fact that it's at the end of the game makes it extremely important to duplicate, hence it's being its number 1. But both weapons are also S tier. The Sacred Relic Sword, I think, is the best of the two, because this is probably the best crowd control weapon in the entire game due to its skill just going ridiculously far in a massive AoE that could do actually good damage. And the weapon itself is actually pretty decent. It does more physical damage than holy damage. You get an okay dexterity and faith scaling. The weapon also does get a 110 crit multiplier too. And when it comes to the Maracas Hammer, I think this is the best hammer in the game. It gets a good strength faith scaling, and it can go better in either or. You're going to get more damage out of strength build, but if you actually wanted to use spells, then I recommend going into a faith build. Now, hammers themselves aren't really going to be the best options. They do really well with charged heavy attack builds or guard countering builds, but you're kind of limited a bit to those. But with the Maracas Hammer, you get an insane skill in Goldbreaker that has you do an amazing AoE attack that can send enemies flying into the air. And if you hit with the weapon and the AoE itself, you're doing over 40 stance damage. And probably best of all yet, the skill gets infinite hype armor. Like, as soon as you click the button, you're like never going to get staggered out of it until you land upon the ground, which you actually get some pretty quick recovery frames. So it's not even going to be that risky of a skill to use too. Like, the only things that I wish that these weapons did have was like a unique moveset. Like if the heavy attack of the Maracas Hammer did a cool AoE, or if the Sacred Relic Sword had a slightly unique heavy attack too. That would have been nice. I feel like a lot of boss weapons tend to be missing that, but it does not change that the Elden Remembrance is the most important remembrance to duplicate in the entire game. Okay, that's now done. If you have your own opinions, please let me know down in the comments below. When it does come to the next video, I am honestly not too sure what I'm going to be doing. Like, we're just struggling along as we end up getting to Night Rain. I might end up making some more build videos. Obviously, some more Soulsborne content is coming along the way as well. So definitely do subscribe for those things. And I'll be streaming almost every single day as well. So definitely do check me out on Twitch. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.